Hello, this is Crystal Stanich, and thank you for joining me for this week's First Chapter Friday. Today I will be reading Dragon Keeper by Robin Hobb. It's the first in her Rain Wilds Chronicles series. Hope you enjoy. Chapter 1, The Riverman. It was supposed to be spring. Dang cold for spring. Dang cold to be sleeping out on the deck instead of inside the deck house. Last night, with the rum in him, and a belt of distant stars twinkling through an opening in the rainforest canopy, it had seemed like a fine idea. The night hadn't seemed so chilly, and the insects had been chirring in the treetops, and the night birds calling to one another, while the bats squeaked and darted out in the open air over the river. It had seemed a fine night to lie back on the deck of his barge and look up at the wide world around him, and savor the river and the rain wilds and his proper place in the world. Tarman had rocked him gently, and all had been right. In the iron-gray dawn, with dew settled on his skin, and clothes and every joint in his body stiff, it seemed a dang fool prank more suited to a boy of 12 than a riverman of close to 30 years. He sat up slowly, and blew out a long breath that steamed in the chill dawn air. He followed it with a heartfelt belch of last night's rum. Then, grumbling under his breath, he lurched to his feet and looked around. Morning, yes. He walked to the railing and made water over the side as he considered the day. Far above his head, in the treetops of the forest canopy, daybirds were awake and calling to one another. But under the trees at the edge of the river, dawn and daylight were tenuous things. Light seeped down, filtered by thousands of new leaves, and divested of its warmth before it reached him. As the sun traveled higher, it would shine down on the open river and send fingers under the trees and through the canopy. But not yet. Not for hours. Leftrin stretched, rolling his shoulders. His shirt clung to his skin unpleasantly. Well, he deserved to be uncomfortable. If any of his crew had been so stupid as to fall asleep out on the deck, that's what he would have told them. But they hadn't been. All 11 of his men slumbered on in the narrow, tiered bunks that lined the aft wall of the deck house. His own more spacious bunk had gone empty. Stupid. It was too early to be awake. The fire in the galley stove was still banked. No hot water simmered for tea, no flat cakes bubbled on the grill, and yet here he was, wide awake, and of a mind to take a walk back under the trees. It was a strange impulse, one he had no conscious rationale for, and yet he recognized it for the kind of itch it was. It came, he knew, from the unremembered dreams of the night before. He reached for them, but the tattered shreds had become threads of cobweb in his mind's grasp, and then were gone. Still, he'd followed their lingering inspiration. He never lost out by paying attention to those impulses, and almost inevitably regretted it the few times he ignored them. He went into the deck house, past his sleeping crew, and through the little galley and forward to his cabin. He exchanged his deck shoes for his church boots. The knee boots of greased bullhide were nearly worn through. The acidic waters of the rain-wild river were not kind to footwear, clothing, wood, or skin. But his boots would survive another trip or two ashore, and as a result, his skin would too. He caught up his jacket from its hook and slung it about his shoulders, and walked aft past the crew. He kicked the foot of the tillman's bunk. Sworge's head jolted up, and the man stared at him blearily. I'm going ashore, going to stretch my legs. Probably be back by breakfast. Aye, Sworge said, the only acceptable reply, and close to the full extent of Sworge's conversational skills. Leftrin grunted an affirmation and left the deck house. The evening before, they had nosed the barge up onto a marshy bank and tied it off to a big leaning tree there. Leftrin swung down from the blunt-nosed bow of the barge onto mud-coated reeds. The barge's painted eyes stared off into the dimness under the trees. 10 days ago, a warm wind and massive rainstorms had swelled the rain-wild river, sending the waters rushing up above their normal banks and over the low shores. In the last 2 days, the waters had receded, but the plant life along the river was still recovering from being underwater for several days of salt-laden flooding. The reeds were coated with filth, and most of the grasses were flattened beneath their burdens of mud. Isolated pockets of water dotted the low bank. As Leftrin strode along, his feet sank and water seeped up to fill in his tracks. He wasn't sure where he was going or why. He let his whim guide him as he ventured away from the riverbank into the deeper shade beneath the vine-draped trees. There, the signs of the recent flooding were even more apparent. Driftwood snags were wedged among the tree trunks. Tangles of muddy foliage and torn webs of vines were festooned about the trees and bushes. Fresh deposits of river silt covered the deep moss and low-growing plants. The gigantic trunks of the enormous trees that held up the roof of the rain wilds were impervious to most floods, but the undergrowth that rioted in their shade was not. In some places, the current had carved a path through the underbrush. In others, the slime and sludge of the flood burdened the foliage so heavily that the brush bent in muddied hummocks. Where he could, Leftrin slogged in the paths that the river current had gouged through the brush. When the mud became too soft, he pushed through the grimy undergrowth. He was soon wet and filthy. A branch pushed aside Spring back, slapping him across the brow and splattering his face with mud. He hastily wiped the stinging stuff from his skin. Like many a riverman, his arms and face had been toughened by exposure to the acidic waters of the rain-wild river. It gave his face a leathery, weathered look, a startling contrast to his gray eyes. He privately believed that this was why he had so few of the growths and less of the scaliness that afflicted most of his rain-wild brethren. Not that he considered himself a thing of beauty, or even a handsome man. The wandering thought made him grin ruefully. He pushed it from his mind and a dangling branch away from his face, and forced his way deeper. There came a moment when he stopped suddenly. Some sensory clue he could not pin down, some scent on the air or some glimpse he had not consciously registered, told him he was near. He stood very still and slowly scanned the area all around him. His eyes went past it, and then the hair on the back of his neck stood up as he swiveled his gaze back suddenly. There. Mud-laden vegetation draped over it, and the river's raging flood had coated it with muck. But a single streak of gray showed through, a wizard-wood log. It was not a huge one, not as big as he had heard that they could be. Its diameter was perhaps 2/3 of his height, and he was not a tall man. But it was big enough, he thought, big enough to make him very wealthy. He glanced back over his shoulder, but the undergrowth that blocked his view of the river and his moored barge would also shield him from spying eyes. He doubted that any of his crew would be curious enough to follow him. They'd been asleep when he left, and no doubt were still abed. The secret trove was his alone. He pushed his way through the vegetation until he could touch the log. It was dead. He had known that even before he had touched it. When he was a boy, he'd been down to the crowned rooster chamber. He'd seen Tintaglia's log before she had hatched from it, and he had known the crawly sensation it had wakened in him. The dragon in this log had died and would never hatch. It didn't much matter to him if it had died while the log still rested on the banks of the cocooning beach, or if tumbling it had taken in the flood, it had killed it. The dragon inside it was dead. The wizardwood was salvageable, and he was the only one who knew where it was. And by his great good fortune, he was one of the few who knew how best to use it. Back in the days when the Kruprus family had made part of its vast fortune from working wizardwood, back before anyone had ever known or admitted what the wood really was, his mother's brothers had been wizard woodworkers. He'd been just a lad, wandering in and out of the low building where his uncle's saws bit slowly through the iron-hard stuff. He'd been 9 when his father had decided he was old enough to come and work on the barge with him. He'd taken up his rightful trade as a bargeman, and he learned his trade from the deck up. And then, when he had just turned 22, his father had died and the barge had come to him. He'd been a riverman for most of his life, but from his mother's side, he had the tools of the wizardwood trade and the knowledge of how to use them. He made a circuit of the log. It was heavy going. The flood waters had wedged it between 2 trees. One end of it had been jammed deep into mud, while the other pointed up at an angle and was wreathed in forest flood debris. He thought of tearing the stuff clear so he could have a good look at it and then decided to leave it camouflaged. He made a quick trip back to the barge, moving stealthily as he took a coil of line from the locker, and then returned hastily to secure his find. It was dirty work, but when he had finished, he was satisfied that even if the river rose again, his treasure would stay put. And that is the beginning of Robin Hobb's Dragon Keeper. If you would like to know what happens next, check out this title on Hoopla. Thank you and have a good day.